remember, the Scottish Government actually runs a balanced budget. Any deficit which does exist is based on our share of money the UK government spends. Scotland doesn't run up debt. It can't. It's not allowed to. All the debt Scotland has is run up on our behalf, allegedly, by the UK government.
At this point, or if there will be a referendum, how do you see negotiations with the EU, between the UK and the EU going, Jim?
Well, the UK is going to leave. There's no question about that. They've said they're going to leave. Whichever way it turns out, the UK citizens say that's what they want, and that's what they're going to get. What worries me as an outside investor is, well, what will happen to the currency? What will they then do? Will the Scots then leave? Because if the Scots leave, Francine, they are going to take their oil. And you look at UK's balance of trade, balance of payments, without the oil, without the Scottish oil, what's left here, Little England, or Great Britain, or Great England, whatever we'll call it then, doesn't have much to sell to the outside world anymore.
And what?
Our economics correspondent Andy Verity is with me to look at the figures. What do they suggest to you?
Well, I mean, the first thing we have to say is these aren't independent. These are put out by the government, and it has a political agenda. Obviously, it wants to get the deal through. But what's interesting is the comparison that they're making. They're basically doing analysis, not forecasts, not saying this is what we think will happen, but this is what we reckon the hit to the economy will be under certain scenarios. So as you mentioned in your intro, just looking at the numbers, and by the way, these both assume no immigration from the EU. That's a hit to the economy. It will be 2.5 to 3.9% smaller than it otherwise would have been 15 years from now, assuming that we get something like the government's white paper deal, which was what came out in July. Now, we're not going to get quite that, but the hope is that we get something like that in terms of its effect on economic growth. That works out at about £100 billion, roughly, of what the economy is worth now. Now, have a look at what they're saying we will get if there's no deal. As you mentioned, 9.3%. Now, that would be a massive hit to GDP, something north of £200 billion. It's like removing the output of the whole of Scotland from the UK economy. But while that does sound frightening, you have to bear in mind the broader numbers here. So that would be about 200 billion, but by that time, the economy would be worth about 2.5 trillion. So it's 9.3% of that. And we have to bear in mind the big assumptions here. No inflow of migrants at all under these assumptions from the EU. And it's all other things being equal. And we have to remember that what really affects the economy isn't just Brexit, it's everything else. So, it's how our industry is doing, it's how productivity is doing, and it's how the rest of the world's economy is doing.
Sure. Okay. Andy, many thanks. Andy Verity there.
The assets in the Scottish financial sector to be?
The assets, broad brush assets in the Scottish financial sector, Scottish domiciled entities, about 10 times Scottish GDP.
Which is, in absolute terms?
Would be north of £1 trillion sterling.
The government expenditure and revenue statement for Scotland. Now, that statement is frankly, in my opinion, crap. Now, in this context, crap was a technical term. It stands for completely rubbish approximations. Now, why do I say that about the JERS statement? Well, simply because I don't believe it. Basically, JERS says that if Scotland is about 8-9% of the whole of the UK, then 8 or 9% of the whole of the UK's income is Scotland's. And 8 or 9% of the spending, near enough, is Scotland's, even though that may not be true. Now, of course, we know in a relationship that's not the way it works. One partner may have more or less income than the other, and they might have quite different spending priorities. And as a result, their actual income or surplus or their spending and deficit, they might run an overdraft and the other runs a current account balance, then those things will not be the same. But JERS assumes that simply Scotland is a part of a bigger whole, when in practice it isn't. It's a separate nation state. So JERS suggests that decisions made for the whole of the UK would continue if Scotland was independent. That's simply not true. Scotland would not have Trident, I'm quite sure. Scotland would not have the same level of armed forces. Scotland would not have the same international relationships that the UK has got. Scotland may decide to have a quite different tax system. Scotland would keep its oil revenues. And let's be clear about it, Scotland's oil revenues could look very more like the Norwegian model if it was independent compared to what they are under the UK as a whole model. Scotland may have a very different perception of debt in the case of being independent, because I think it's quite reasonable to argue that Scotland may have little or no national debt in the event that it was independent, because it ran a surplus for so long that it didn't accumulate the UK deficit, which is being borne elsewhere, but which is being charged to Scotland, even though it might never have generated it. All these things would make a genuinely Scottish financial statement look fundamentally different from the statement that we've got now.